Today, Gaby and I are talking about management consultancies and burnout. She is sharing with us her personal experience of burnout whilst working as a management consultant and some of her ideas about what management consultancies could do better. Gaby is a burnout prevention and recovery coach and trainer with a Big Four tax background. As many others before her, she burnt out to a crisp, and by the time she became a manager, she was ready to go. Gaby now runs her own company, The Unspecialist, helping individuals and companies to make burnout an exception and not the rule. I hope you enjoy our conversation. Here we go. It's nearly 10 years since my burnout experience, and I believe that it wasn't necessary for me to burn out, and it's not necessary for you either. In this podcast, my guests and I share our real-life experiences with burnout. We get into the science of stress and share actionable tips on how to prevent burnout and how to recover from it. I'm Holden, ex-management consultant and burnout survivor. I work with management consultants to help them avoid and overcome burnout. I help them to get intentional about their choices, rebuild their energy, and embed new healthy habits so that they can get back to loving life. Hello, Gaby. So welcome. Thank you so much for joining me.
No, thank you for having me, Hannah. I'm really glad to be here.
So I wanted to start today. I want to get on to talking about management consultancies because that's something that we've both had experience in. But let's start with you personally. It would be interesting to understand a bit about your personal experiences with stress and burnout and how you came to now be talking about these topics. So what that looked like for you, and how did you work with your work, or how did work handle your situation as you experienced burnout? That would be a great place to start.
Yeah, so straight out of uni and having done summer internships, I landed a job in tax consulting at one of the big firms. We all know them if we've worked in management consulting, but let's not name names. It was like a job that was a dream come true. I got on a graduate scheme. I got here before I started my final year at university, so I didn't have to do anything in my final year. And then straight out of university, after a bit of a summer, I was there in an open space office, working as a tax consultant from day one. And frankly, a few months in, I knew this wasn't going to be what I was going to do for life. But I thought, okay, maybe I'll change teams, I'll change specialisms, maybe it'll get more interesting as I get more senior, maybe it's just the grunt work that you do as a junior. And I changed teams after a year, which was what everyone was doing. It got a bit more interesting from the tax perspective, but the work got no better. It is fast paced, it's a lot of pressure, a lot of client demands and internal demands. And being a perfectionist, I wanted to meet all of those demands to the best of my ability and beyond, because, the best of my ability was just, that's normal. Let's do more than the best of my ability. And then, COVID hit and we didn't stop, we didn't pause. The world stopped, but work never did. And I sometimes joke, it's a bit of a dark joke, that there's two things that are sure in life, and that's death and taxes. And I was in taxes. So our jobs was fairly secure. All transaction work. So I worked on people buying and selling property, or other companies buying and selling property a lot. That all stopped because no one knew what was going on. But then a lot of other problems arose as our advice was needed on. So while other people were furloughed, while other companies were slowing down, we were full steam ahead. While dealing with this massive emergency, I couldn't go see my family because they were in a different country, and obviously no one technically could. It was a lot of pressure, and it was a whole also stress of what will happen if I catch this virus, which everyone else was feeling. But at the time, we weren't sort of allowed to even take a pause because the clients came first. So it was all taking phone calls with big companies from my bedroom, and I was thinking, like, what am I doing? This feels so wrong. And a few months into the pandemic, my anxiety symptoms just got bad. I was always an anxious person, but with all that pressure, with all that stress that was ongoing, with all the work that was on my to-do list, I sometimes have had a to-do list spilling over an A4 page of paper, which is ridiculous now that I think about it. But a few months in, I got into a complete freeze state. I was sat in front of my laptop and I couldn't do anything. I struggled with completing tasks that I would normally do with ease, not to mention difficult tasks, because those I would just sit and stare at because I didn't even know where to start. I didn't know how to handle them. I was just frozen. And it just brings that back to those stress responses. You have freeze, flight, fight, and freeze. I was past fight or flight. There was no fight or flight left in me. It was just me being in this chair that I'm sat in now, not being able to do anything and just crying, because at that point the sight of the Outlook pop-up would trigger tears in me, even if it was a newsletter. And I got signed off work because I opened up to my coach at work, and it wasn't intentional, it was completely accidental. We were just having a routine sort of monthly catch-up, and I just burst into tears. And she was like, okay, log off. I think it was a Thursday or a Friday. She was like, yeah, come back on Wednesday. Just take a few days off, like calling sick. Well, I didn't come back for a month because my GP decided that a few days was nothing. It's not going to do anything. And at that point, I just thought it was anxiety. But when I started working with a therapist, I realized, and she made me realize, that I was actually in burnout, that I was constantly exhausted, there's a few main symptoms of burnout. There's exhaustion, there is cynicism, and I didn't see any point in what I was doing, which also felt normal. I was in a big corporate, working for big corporates, and sometimes, even stereotypically, that can be like, well, doing a work that doesn't do anything positive for the world. So even when I was feeling cynical, I thought I was just, okay, it's normal, I'm seeing the reality of the job I'm doing. Mm-hmm. When there was actually a symptom, and that exhaustion, that sleepiness, that tiredness, that inability to focus, I mean, it was right there on the plate. The anxiety was just the cherry on top, that added to that burnout.
Wow. And so all of this within how long had you been in the consulting role, in the consulting organisation that you were in?
That was under 2 years, actually, at that point.
Right.
And you know, I when I got signed off, I kind of knew that consulting and me were just not a match made in heaven. My personality, my sort of health tendencies, I knew it wasn't going to work, but also this was the only thing I really knew at that point. I went into that career straight out of university, and I got back into the job and thought, okay, maybe now I'm better, now I've rested. I had a month off, then for another month I was sort of on a return to work. I was working part-time, and everyone was very sort of, oh yeah, you're working part-time, great. But no one knew what happened to me, apart from most of my closest co-workers and my managers. And you have multiple managers in that situation, so some people knew, some people didn't. And when I came back, because you asked what has work done for me, I had a sit down with a manager where we agreed actions that would help me manage anxiety, manage burnout while in the workplace. But it became my responsibility to implement those points when I didn't have the mental energy or mental space to advocate for myself. And it would have been so helpful to have had an advocate.
Can you give examples of what sort of thing, what those items might have been?
Yes, so the idea was that I wouldn't work on any very urgent projects that would have a lot of time pressure, because that can become stressful.
Okay, and so
So
that
I
was
would
agreed with
work on
one manager, but not
transactions.
necessarily the manager who was then responsible for allocating your work. And so the idea was that you were then supposed to say, no, that's not great for me. And like you said, some people would have known and understood the process that you were going through, and you might have been then having to have those difficult conversations with somebody else, like you say, advocating on your behalf. So I can see now that you've kind of given us some light to it, like given it some color, I can see how challenging that would be if you're mentally exhausted, physically exhausted, and then you're being expected to have what can be quite challenging conversations because you're effectively learning to say no to somebody, right? And then having to try and explain it to them, which isn't necessarily what you want to be doing every day. Um, yeah, okay. And so they came up with a sensible list of things that you were expected to
Hmm.
stand by and advocate for yourself over. So how did that
Yes,
go?
it didn't. It didn't go. That's the thing. I mustered the energy once to tell someone, oh, sorry, I'm not working on transactions at the moment because of like my illness, and I wasn't even mentioning what. It
Mm,
was not that I'm generally an open person about my mental health, but it's not with everyone they want to discuss it. And when you're in that vulnerable position, relying on the person who's not well to advocate for themselves is just a recipe for disaster, because a year later I was off sick again
mm-hmm,
because that pressure built up again. Because there were exams to take, because that's what you do in professional services. In the first few years of your career, you take a lot of exams. I didn't finish mine, but I had a total of planned 17 exams over 3 years, which is on top of your full-time job,
mm-hmm,
which is an added pressure, especially as you can get fired for failing them. So there were exams that I had to pass in that time, and that was a great amount of pressure. And and yeah, I ended up sort of never recovering from that burnout and being bad enough again that I had to be signed off, because in part because that's my tendency, and natural tendencies towards burnout are a thing, and I acknowledge that. But also the support wasn't quite there, and I know that varies from team to team, but that's my personal experience. It just didn't happen.
mm, yeah, I agree with you. I think that there are attributes of us as individuals that help or don't help when it comes to burnout. And some of those are actually positive qualities when management consultancies are looking for people to work for them. So having perfectionists, having overachievers, they specifically go out there and try to hire these individuals, right?
Oh
But those
yeah,
are the individuals
absolutely.
who are prone to pushing themselves too far and expecting too much of themselves and not giving themselves a break and feeling like it's never enough and always wanting it to be better. And so yes, there are individual tendencies, and then there's the workplace tendencies. And you touched on a lack of control and not knowing what to expect every day, and the workload being unrealistic. And so yeah, some of the workplace attributes that have a negative contribution towards burnout. So you seem well now. um, Can you just, just without too much detail, but what did it look like? What turned things around? And now you focus on helping others with burnout. So how did you go from being in a place of burnout to being well and helping others?
Yeah, so burnout recovery, like anything, is a process. It's not that one day you will do something and it will turn the burnout off in your head. Like, it's not like a stove sort of fire. It's like more like a forest fire. Even if you stop it, there's still smoke going on.
Mm,
Um, so it is a life change, not, I can't give you three things to do and they're gonna cure your burnout. I wish I would be selling those like hotcakes, but it's not available. So I started putting much more attention and much more effort into myself rather than
mm-hmm,
my work.
mm-hmm,
Um, which was incredibly difficult.
Mm-hmm.
As an overachiever, as a perfectionist, the done is better than perfect is something that I repeat to myself, but that is so hard for me, because perfection is what I was taught to strive for so many years, from school, from early years into my career. So sometimes I post LinkedIn posts with typos in them, and I just let them go. Um, I do a one read, and that's it. If I miss something, I miss something. And doing things like that, just allowing yourself to be wrong, to make mistakes, um, and just accept it. And sometimes my friend messages me and says like, "Oh, you like have a typo there." I'm like, "Okay, I'll correct it," or "It's fine, it'll be that. It doesn't change the meaning." Um, but taking care of my body was also very important, because when we are sat at our desks, this is not a natural human thing to do. Our ancestors didn't just sit all day. It's a ridiculous invention of the modern sort of the last 150 years maybe. Um, hell, my great grandparents were working the fields. They weren't sat at any desks. For me, something that I also advocate to my clients is yin yoga. It's a sort of meditative type of yoga,
Mm-hmm.
where you stretch very deeply, and it can, I'll sound quite woo-woo now, but it can unlock the sort of trauma that's stored in your body, because our body does store trauma.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not making this up now.
It's all right. I've got other episodes on how what's happening in our mind affects our body.
Yeah.
I've got a whole episode on that, around the peptides that our
Mm-hmm.
thought processes create and the impact that has on every system in our body. So
Yeah.
yeah, we've covered that. And if you want to hear more on that, then go dig out the body mind episodes. Yeah, so yin yoga is a particular type of yoga where you hold poses for a very long time, get into a
Yeah.
very deep stretch. I'm a twice qualified yoga teacher, so I do a couple of different types of yoga styles. Yin is unique for the length of time that you hold poses for. So sometimes it will be as little as 2 minutes, but sometimes it can be as long as 20 minutes, depending on what the poses are and what the teacher's doing. And because of that, it stretches the muscles in a way that kind of goes deeper than your average stretch. It's not like kind of stretching off after a run. It's far deeper than that. And yes, they are known for people having emotional releases, not just the physical muscle releasing, but people kind of tapping into emotions that they weren't aware were there, or were perhaps aware of them but not going there. So yes, that it doesn't surprise me that you found that helpful.
Yeah, no, it's honestly fantastic, and it's not just on the physical level, because Ian teaches you not to go to 100%,
Mm-hmm.
because being in a deep stretch at 100% for 5 minutes is just actually impossible, and definitely not achieving what you want to achieve, which is that relaxation.
Mm-hmm.
So it's been teaching me to be patient with myself, to listen to myself, and to not do at 100%.
Mm.
Very few tasks need your 100%. And that's also a learning that I've had from burnout. I was on, doing the whole like healthy living stuff, which I'm sure everyone's heard a million times. Getting your sleep in, getting your food in, that is, relatively healthy. I also go for walks every day. Um, Hugging people is really helpful, because all the good hormones are released. So it's more of a mindset and lifestyle change than like start doing to-do lists a specific way and it's going to solve your burnout. It's not going to. It's not going to have any effect, really.
Yeah. So productivity hacks have their place, but they're not going to fix burnout. And like you said, I think a lot of people look for quick fixes, and I think that a lot of people experience burnout quite rapidly, that they're surprised that they're suddenly experiencing it, and the onset of burnout seems to happen rapidly. But really, burnout happens as a consequence of chronic stress. So actually, if you look back over the period of chronic stress, this is something that's been building up for normally years. So for you, it was about 2 years when you first had burnout, and then another year later when when it kind of relapsed. And yeah, so you can't expect to undo years and years of stress in a week's retreat or something. It's just not going to happen. I think it's really good that you talk about looking after yourself, and you talk about it physically, but also about that learning how to be okay with mistakes, which is about handling that negative self-talk that we all have, of like beating ourselves up for weeks about the typo or whatever it might be. Yeah, so yeah, I think there are different aspects of looking after yourself, and I love the fact that you were talking about hugging too, and yoga. Well, the thing that I think that's interesting about yoga that you just mentioned was about how yoga, this is kind of partly my interpretation of it. So for me, yoga is about having this safe space where you intentionally experience things which aren't necessarily pleasant, so challenging things. And yin yoga is one of these yoga styles that allows you to experience challenging things, because holding a pose for that period of time, your brain starts telling you, I've got to move, I've got to move, I've got to get, this is ridiculous, I can't hold this for any longer. Your brain is going to start doing all of that. And then you kind of have to check in with yourself and say, is this my body that needs me to back off? Or is this my brain that's full of nonsense and telling me that? And so it increases that awareness. And I think that that's an amazing thing that yoga does for you. Because like you say, you can then take that off the mat and learn to not push yourself to 100 and something % every time, because you've learned that on the mat in yoga. So that, anyway, I could talk for weeks on the topic of so let's not do that. Let's talk a bit about, what do you think consultancies could do differently to better prepare people? Like you were describing that you went straight out of university into your consulting job. So what could they do to better prepare people for consulting? And once they're there, how do you feel that they could better support the consultants that they have? So, you just described about asking people to advocate for themselves, for example, isn't really going to work. So what could consultancies do differently and better?
Yes, I think what consultancies are pretty amazing at, especially in those like technical areas that I was in, is training people on the technical areas that they work in. So I received a wealth of training on the technical aspects of tax, of like the specific little areas, including the exams I took. I was on, I got sort of a long period of training at the beginning of my graduate scheme. Um, and that included things like, writing emails, going to meetings, taking notes. So there was space for soft skills, but there was nothing on well-being and keeping yourself well. And you go into those big jobs, big responsibilities, often dealing with large sums of money, even if they're not physically in your hands, you know what's at stake. And you've gone there straight from university, from a very structured environment where there was a module for 10 weeks, and then you wrote an exam, and then you went on to the next module, which was very similar at school. You do a certain piece of it, part of education, you take an exam, move on. Whereas you go into a job and there is no end. There is always new tasks rolling in. And with consulting, you don't necessarily know what's coming tomorrow. You don't know who you're going to be working with necessarily, what your client's going to come in with, because you might have planned the most perfect day for the next day, and then one of your biggest client comes in with, we urgently need to find out this thing, and you suddenly left with this perfect list that you can't really execute, and no one taught you how to prioritize and deprioritize tasks, and no one taught you boundary setting. So you haven't told that manager that you're already very busy with other things, and is there someone else who could help with that, or whether they can help you reprioritize and speak with other people for you. So that's the problem. I feel like the juniors that come in are left to learn how to take care of themselves by themselves, or by watching their seniors who also were not taught by anyone, picking up tips here and there, and a lot of the tips being, yeah, show your best, like, put your best foot forward, show your best performance to everyone. You want to impress that partner, you want to impress that partner, you want to be on that client that's good for your career. That's what I was hearing. I wasn't hearing set healthy boundaries, leave on time, make sure you're like resting in the evenings. Around exams, for example, we would be put in college, and the people who teach in those colleges are former accountants or auditors, and they have those same unhealthy habits. So they would tell us to work, mornings, evenings, and weekends with no breaks, because it's worth it for those exams. And I was just sat there thinking, well, that's not how the human brain works. We can't work without breaks. This is not productive. This is not going to get the best results. And, we never taught those things. Our parents usually don't teach those things to us. Our schools don't teach those to us. So I think a robust program of well-being, in a sort of sense even of, you need to do this to do your job best, because we are talking about high achievers who have come in to a fancy job, let's call it, who want to do their best. So if you tell them, oh, relax, they're going to be like, well, I don't have time to relax. This needs to be framed as, this is for you to do the absolute best job, and in a way teaching them how to take care of themselves. But this isn't just reliant on those juniors, because as we've spoken about my example, putting all the responsibility on the junior is too much responsibility on the junior, and particularly because you do have that imbalance of power, even if you have the best relationships with your managers. And I had great relationships with my managers, but they were still managers, and I still answered to them. And they still, took my case, for example, at the end of the year to get me a promotion. I still needed to impress them to some extent. So in order to implement early years wellbeing programs, you need manager buy-in. The managers need to be there to support that well-being journey. Because if there are sort of like, oh yeah, this is washy-washy stuff, or like, say there's a session with a well-being practitioner, and there's sort of a client call, maybe not the most important client, they're like, yeah, ditch that session, come to the client call, this is more important, client's always the most important. And that's the management consulting sort of mantra, client is the most important. We don't say no to clients, we don't put boundaries in with clients. I pretty much have more boundaries with my coaching clients and my corporate clients now than I did working at a big company that had quite a lot of pull. So teaching those people make them have better careers, healthy careers, and having that support from the managers actually ensures it happens. Because if there's no support from managers, nothing's going to happen. I could run 300 hours of wellbeing webinars for juniors. It's not going to do anything if the managers are not on board.
Yeah, so this is interesting because I'm thinking about there are a couple of trains of thought that I've got here, but one of them is the fact that actually managers didn't get the training either, and whilst they may have made it to wherever they are now, having not experienced burnout. They may have experienced it and managed to get themselves back into work, or maybe they haven't and they've got this far, but they are also going to be having the same problem. And you described earlier about how it kind of filters down, it comes down from above, the pressure just with no boundaries being put in place by anybody, and it just lands on the shoulders of the junior to then do the work, right? But that doesn't mean that the manager is then free of all stress to do with the situation. And so, in fact, that training is probably required for everybody in the organization, because they all missed out on it, right? You missed out on it. They all missed out on it. But the other thing was, I was on a podcast talking about exec burnout recently, and I think one of the most interesting things about educating executives and leaders about burnout, but also about what they can do, is so they can become better role models. Because the example that somebody gave on that podcast was making sure that you don't check your emails, or you're not seen sending emails at crazy hours of the day or night. As an example, like logging on at 5 o'clock in the morning, you don't need to do that. And if managers are doing it, it sets a precedent. And then as a junior person, you feel like, oh, I'm supposed to be online at 5 o'clock in the morning. And so, yeah, that kind of training is needed. And these kinds of conversations are needed, and awareness is needed across the whole spectrum of juniors through to execs, because we really need the good stuff filtering down to everybody from above, right? We need the role models. We need to witness how our manager has set a boundary with a client who's just come up with an urgent need for today, and how they've said, well, we're actually servicing another client today, but we can fit you in later in this week. Like, if we see that, we're going to mimic that. So it's kind of, yeah, how we can train at the top and then see those behaviors filter down.
Yeah, I think it's important that you said lead by example, and you give an example of an action rather than sort of sending emails reminding people to take breaks when that would happen. We would get emails from partners being like, remember to take care of yourself, remember to take breaks, exercise. And I remember sitting next to those people in the office, and they were not taking breaks, which is even less visible during working from home. We don't sort of physically see our leaders sometimes. So if I'm thinking of how to lead in the times of working from home being such a big part of our lives and still showing those well-being behaviors, I think that's really important and something to give a serious thought to.
Yeah, they need to be. I don't. The term monkey see, monkey do keeps popping into my head, and I don't mean to belittle anybody with that, but we all learn from other people, right? We learn from what we've seen, and those juniors are not going to learn boundary setting unless their seniors are setting boundaries, because whilst even if they had the skills to set the boundary even if your juniors had the skills to set boundaries, if they weren't seeing that was what's expected in this environment, then they're not going to do it. Yeah. So there's a lot to be said about training up our execs and our leaders and our managers. And I'd like you to describe what you wanted to do in this space, because I know that you were talking about offering some kind of training or going in and helping with these kind of programs. What is it that you want to bring to organizations?
Yeah, so my aim is not to be working with people who are so burnt out they can't get out of bed. Frankly, as a coach, this is outside of my area of expertise. At that point, when people are at that point, they need to see a therapist, most likely they need to see a doctor. I think prevention of burnout is where we need to be putting more money, and this is really for the good of the business, because we're talking about Gen Zs now joining those organizations, and Gen Zs are not going to stay if they're unhappy in their roles or if they're burning out. They're going to go. Sort of the times of people just staying in careers because they got a good job, I think are pretty much becoming over. I mean, case in point, myself, I left because I burnt out and I wasn't ready to put up with that. So my aim is to, of course, work across organizations, work with people at different levels, teaching them those skills to look after themselves, the prioritization, the boundary setting, those very important things. Because as you said, no one will stop that. So everyone needs it. But my ideal would be to be able to work with those people fresh out of universities. There's like people in their early 20s that have not had much professional experience, have not had a sort of a previous caring boss who may have taught them that, for example, and haven't had much opportunity at university because it's not taught at universities either.
Well, no, I mean, boundaries aren't, you don't set boundaries at university. You get set, here's your task, here's your deadline, here's your exam date, here's your dissertation submission date. There's no kind of, boundaries don't need to be set. And universities, to a certain extent, have made sure that things are spaced out appropriately for people and that it is a manageable workload. So that boundary setting has been done on their behalf. So no, those soft skills are definitely not taught. They're not required there. So it makes perfect sense what you're saying. And I know that when we've spoken before, you're particularly passionate about that group of people, the new joiners into management consultants, and how they need that education, that support and guidance on how they can manage all of this. So thank you for talking about that. We're going to wrap up shortly. Was there anything we could probably talk all night, but given that we're not going to, was there anything else that you wanted to say before we wrap up?
I think just a little piece of advice. We're taught to prioritize things, and we're not taught that to prioritize. We also need to deprioritize. So it's a dual action. We can't just be prioritizing endlessly. To prioritize some things, we need to deprioritize others. And I think that is something that I wish I knew when I first started, when I tried to do absolutely everything on my to-do list myself and ASAP. So
I've heard it said
that's something I'd like to leave people with.
If you think everything's a priority, it means that nothing's a priority. And so, like you say, you need to figure out what is not a priority so that those that are at the top of the list genuinely do get the time and attention. That's a good one. All right. Thank you so much for joining me. It's been a pleasure having you here and having a good old chat about the pros and cons of consulting and the challenges in consulting. So thanks so much.
No, thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure being here and chatting with you.
If you would like to contact Gaby, then the best place to find her is on LinkedIn. I will include a link to her profile in the show notes. The other place to find her is on her website, which is www.theunspecialist.com. So that's www.theunspecialist.com. These podcasts are here to help you manage your stress and burnout, and your feedback is really valuable. So please rate this podcast and also drop me a note with any questions, suggestions, or feedback that you might have. One of the most common questions I get asked is, where should I start? And I believe that the best place for you to start is to learn how to soothe your nervous system. I've created a free download with instructions for 5 different ways that you can do just this, and all of them work pretty much instantly. It's called the Essential Toolkit for Management Consultants. You can download it now at www.hannahholden.co.uk/essential. One last thing, it's the legal language. This podcast is presented solely for educational and entertainment purposes. It is not intended as a substitute for the advice of your doctor, psychotherapist, or other qualified professional.